It was one of those calm mornings where everything felt peaceful. The streets were quiet, the sun was soft, and a man walked his dog down a long lane that led toward the woods behind his house. He looked like an ordinary man, someone you would probably pass by without thinking twice. He wore a gray hoodie, faded jeans, and old running shoes. His dog, a large Belgian Malinois with a black snout and kind brown eyes, walked close to his leg, always alert but calm. The man lived alone at the edge of the neighborhood. People often saw him early in the morning, always at the same hour, walking that same path with his dog. He rarely spoke much, but when he did, his voice carried quiet confidence. Some neighbors liked him, others found him distant, but none of them knew who he truly was. They saw only the man who kept to himself, cared deeply for his dog, and lived a quiet life. His name was David. His dog's name was Rex. David had bought the small house 2 years earlier. It wasn't fancy, just a one-story home with a small front porch and a yard that backed up to a forest trail. He liked it that way. He didn't need much space or attention. All he wanted was peace, after years of living a life where peace didn't exist. Rex had been with him since his last deployment overseas. Back then, Rex wasn't just a pet. He was a trained military dog who had saved David's life more than once. They had been through the hardest situations together: desert storms, endless nights, and missions that required silence, patience, and courage. When the day came for both of them to retire, David couldn't imagine leaving Rex behind. So, he adopted him officially. From that day, they were inseparable. Every morning, Rex would wait by the door before dawn, tail wagging slightly, waiting for David to grab his leash. They would walk through the empty streets, sometimes running for a few miles before stopping near the creek where Rex would play in the water. David never raised his voice, never rushed him. He just stood there watching the dog enjoy himself. He didn't talk much to anyone, but the people who saw him could tell that Rex meant everything to him. The dog wasn't just company. He was family, the only living reminder of a past that David had learned to keep buried. When he first moved into the neighborhood, a few people tried to be friendly. They invited him to cookouts, asked him about his work, tried to get to know him. He was always polite but distant. He would say, "I used to work in security," and quickly change the subject. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. In reality, he had been one of the most highly trained Delta Force operatives in the military. For years, he led secret missions that were never recorded publicly. He had been trained to survive, to lead, to think when others panicked. But now he wanted nothing more than to live quietly with his dog and forget the things he had seen. To most people, he was simply a quiet man with a strong-looking dog. Rex was obedient and protective, but gentle when he needed to be. Children from down the street sometimes waved at him when David walked by, and Rex would wag his tail but never run off. He understood boundaries. He had been trained for discipline, not aggression. Life had fallen into a steady rhythm. David spent his days doing small carpentry projects, reading or repairing old tools in his shed. Sometimes he would volunteer at a nearby veterans center, helping younger soldiers adjust to life after service. But he never spoke about himself. He didn't want pity or praise. For him, every day was about staying calm, staying grounded, and finding peace through routine. One afternoon, after returning from the hardware store, David sat on his porch while Rex lay near his feet. The warm wind carried the sound of kids playing down the street. A few cars passed by and everything felt still. For a man who had once lived through chaos, silence was his best friend. But peace, as David had learned many times before, rarely lasts forever. A few weeks later, something small started the series of events that would change everything. One of the neighbors, an older man who had just moved in, didn't like dogs. He often complained that Rex barked too much, even though the dog only barked when someone came too close to their property. David had tried to explain politely that Rex was harmless and well-trained, but the man didn't want to hear it. To him, Rex looked intimidating, and that was enough. One evening, as David and Rex returned from their walk, they passed by the man's yard. The man was watering his plants when Rex let out a single bark at a squirrel running by. The man flinched, dropped his hose, and shouted, "Keep that dog under control." David calmly replied. "He's fine, sir. He's trained." But the neighbor grumbled something under his breath and went inside. A few days later, that same neighbor called the police to report a large, aggressive dog in the neighborhood. He said he was concerned for his safety. When the dispatcher asked if the dog had attacked anyone, the man said no, but insisted it was a threat waiting to happen. The report didn't seem urgent, but 2 officers on patrol decided to check it out the next afternoon. They arrived at David's street, parking near his driveway, unaware of who they were about to encounter. That day, David was outside fixing the gate near his fence. Rex was sitting beside him, watching closely as always. The officers stepped out of their car, their hands resting near their belts. David stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, wondering what was going on. "Sir, we got a report about a dangerous dog in this area," one of the officers said. David nodded politely. "You must be talking about my dog. He's not dangerous, I assure you." "Mind if we take a look?" the second officer asked. David's tone stayed calm. "Of course, but please don't make any sudden moves. He's trained to protect, but he listens to me." The officers exchanged a look. Something about the man's steady, confident voice made them cautious. Rex stayed seated, tail still, ears perked. His eyes followed every movement carefully. "Can you secure the dog?" one of the officers said, stepping forward. "He's already secure," David said, "but I'll have him sit further back." He gave Rex a simple command. The dog obeyed immediately, walking backward and sitting near the porch. The moment was tense but controlled, until a sudden noise shattered the calm. Somewhere nearby, a car door slammed hard, startling the dog. Rex stood up quickly, barking once. It wasn't a threat, just instinct, but one of the officers flinched. His hand went to his holster. "Easy," David said firmly, holding out his palm toward Rex. "Sit!" Rex obeyed instantly, but fear was already in the air. The officer's voice grew sharp. "Sir, restrain that dog now." David stepped slightly forward. "He's fine. You don't need your hand on your weapon." To the officers, that movement looked like defiance. In reality, it was a veteran trying to calm a situation that was spiraling too fast. The second officer raised his hand slightly, as if signaling for backup. "Sir, stay where you are." David froze, his instincts kicking in. He could sense their tension like a soldier senses danger in a war zone. He knew this kind of situation could go wrong in seconds. "Listen," he said quietly. "I've handled situations worse than this. Just breathe. The dog is trained. You don't need to." But before he could finish, Rex, sensing his owner's rising stress, stepped forward. He didn't bark, didn't lunge. He just stood closer to David. That was all it took. One of the officers shouted, "Get the dog back." Then a sharp sound broke the silence. A gunshot. Everything went still. Rex dropped to the ground. The echo faded, leaving only the sound of David's breath catching in his throat. For a moment he didn't move. He couldn't. He just stared at Rex lying still on the ground, his body motionless. The officers froze too, realizing what they had done. David slowly knelt down beside Rex, his hands trembling slightly as he touched the dog's fur. Rex blinked weakly once, then went still. David's lips parted, but no sound came out. The same man who had led missions in silence, who had lost friends in combat, who had seen the worst of humanity, now sat in his yard, unable to breathe, unable to speak, holding the only thing that had kept him human. The officers tried to talk, to explain, to justify what happened, but their voices faded in his ears. Everything around him blurred, the houses, the people gathering, the noise. All he could hear was his own heartbeat and the faint ringing in his ears. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at them. He simply stayed there, holding Rex's head in his hands, whispering something so soft that no one could hear it. For the neighbors who watched from a distance, it was heartbreaking. Some filmed, some stood in silence, but none of them knew what this quiet man was truly capable of, or how much discipline it took for him not to react. He had been trained to stay calm under fire, to control his emotions when chaos erupted, and now, that same training kept him still when his heart wanted to break. When animal control arrived to take Rex away, David stood up slowly. His face showed no anger, only deep emptiness. He watched the van drive off, then turned to the officers. His eyes were calm, too calm. "I'll handle this," he said quietly. Then he walked back inside his house and shut the door. Inside, the walls that once held peace now felt hollow. He sat down in his chair, staring at the floor for a long time. His hands rested on his knees, unmoving. The house was silent, but his mind was loud, filled with memories of every mission, every moment he had held his composure under pressure. Only this time it wasn't an enemy who took something from him. It was his own country, the same country he had risked his life for. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at Rex's collar on the table. He didn't cry, didn't speak. But deep inside something began to shift, not out of anger, but out of the deep, cold realization that silence was no longer enough. For the first time in years, the soldier inside him began to wake up again, and the world had no idea what kind of man they had just provoked. That night felt longer than any night David had known in years. He sat in silence, staring at the empty spot where Rex used to lie. The collar on the table gleamed faintly under the dim light, reminding him of the weight of what had just happened. He didn't move for hours. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. He just sat there, lost somewhere between memory and disbelief. Every once in a while he would hear the echo of that single gunshot in his mind. It kept looping over and over, louder each time. He had heard gunfire many times in his life, but never one that hurt like this. This one had taken something from him that no war ever could. Outside, the street was quiet again. The flashing lights were gone. The officers had left, and the neighbors had returned indoors. But nothing was the same. The stillness didn't bring peace anymore. It only brought emptiness. When morning came, David walked outside. The sky was pale and the air was cool. The spot near the fence where Rex had fallen was still visible. He knelt down, his fingers brushing over the dry grass. For a moment, it felt like Rex was still there, waiting for his command, ready to follow wherever he went. He stood up slowly and went back inside. He opened the closet in the hallway and pulled out an old wooden box. It was covered in dust, untouched for years. When he opened it, the smell of oil and leather filled the air. Inside were a few medals, a folded flag, and a photo of him and his team from long ago. They were younger then, standing together in the middle of nowhere, tired but proud. Rex was there too, sitting in front of them wearing his service vest. David picked up the photo and stared at it for a long time. The memories came flooding back. Missions deep in foreign lands, nights spent in silence, and mornings filled with orders that never made sense to anyone outside their world. He remembered the times Rex had warned him seconds before danger struck. He remembered the times that Dog had saved his life. He closed the box gently and set it aside. Later that day, someone knocked on his door. It was a woman from the neighborhood holding a tray of food. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. He was such a good dog." David nodded, managing a faint smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. She hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say more but didn't know how. Then she simply placed the tray down and left. When the door closed, the house went silent again. That afternoon, David drove to the animal center to ask about Rex. The woman at the desk recognized him immediately and looked uneasy. "Sir," she said gently, "we're deeply sorry for what happened." The officers filed their report. "There will be a review." "A review," David repeated under his breath. "Yes, sir," she continued. "They'll check the footage, talk to witnesses." He cut her off politely. "Thank you. That won't bring him back, but I appreciate your time." When he walked back to his truck, the sun was already high. He sat inside for a while, staring at the steering wheel. He didn't know what to do next. Part of him wanted to drive far away, to leave everything behind. But another part of him, the soldier who had lived by discipline and justice, refused to let this go unnoticed. That night, he pulled out his old laptop. He hadn't used it in a long time. He started searching quietly. Police protocols, canine response policies, complaint forms, everything that might tell him what was supposed to happen that day. He wanted to understand what had gone wrong. The more he read, the more he realized that what happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a chain of poor judgment, fear, and negligence. The officers hadn't followed procedure. They hadn't called animal control. They hadn't de-escalated. They'd reacted without understanding. But David knew something that most people didn't. In the military, mistakes like that got people killed. That's why he had spent his life training to stay calm in every situation. He had been taught that panic was the enemy, that every decision had consequences. Now he saw what panic had done to them, and to him. In the days that followed, David stayed quiet, but his mind was working. He started documenting everything. He wrote down times, names, and details from memory. He replayed the event in his head over and over, searching for every second that might reveal what went wrong. The local news soon picked up the story, though only as a small mention. Police respond to aggressive dog complaint. Incident ends tragically. That was all it said. No one mentioned who the man was or what the dog meant to him. To the world, it was just another short news story, but a neighbor who had filmed part of the incident shared the video online. It showed Rex standing still, not attacking, not lunging, just standing near his owner. The sound of the gunshot came next and the clip ended there. Within hours, people began to comment, asking questions, demanding answers. David didn't respond to anyone. He didn't post, didn't call reporters, didn't argue. He stayed silent the way he had been trained. He wanted to understand before he acted. A few days later, an old friend from his service days called him. The man's voice on the phone was deep and familiar. "I saw the clip," he said quietly. "That was your dog, wasn't it?" "Yes," David answered simply. "I'm sorry, brother," the friend said. "You holding up?" "I'm fine," David replied, though both of them knew it wasn't true. After a pause, the friend continued, "You know, people will want to hear your side. You can't just let them bury it under paperwork." David looked out the window at the empty yard. "Not yet," he said softly. "I'm not ready to talk, but I'm not done either." That night, he opened the box again. He took out his old Delta Force patch and placed it on the table beside Rex's collar. Two symbols from different parts of his life, one of war, one of love, side by side. They looked strange together, but somehow, they told the story of who he was. He picked up his phone and started dialing a number he hadn't used in years. An old contact, someone who had once been a journalist covering military operations overseas. When the call connected, the woman's voice sounded surprised. "David," she said, "I haven't heard from you in forever. How are you?" "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "Not about me, but about something that happened here." The next day, they met at a small diner outside town. The woman listened as David explained what had happened. He told her everything, the report, the confrontation, the shot. She didn't interrupt, just took notes carefully, watching his face as he spoke. When he finished, she said, "This isn't just about your dog, is it?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's about what people become when they stop seeing others as human. That's what scares me," she nodded slowly. "You want this story told?" "I want the truth told," he replied. Over the next few days, she began gathering evidence. The neighbor's video, witness statements, the police report, even body camera footage that wasn't yet public. Together, they started piecing everything together. What they found was clear. The situation had been badly handled from the start. There had been no real threat, no reason for weapons to be drawn. The journalist's article was published a week later under the title, "A Quiet Man, His Dog, and the Mistake That Should Never Have Happened." It spread quickly. People were shocked to learn that the man whose dog was shot had once served in the country's most elite military unit. They couldn't understand how someone who had risked everything for his country could be treated with such carelessness in his own neighborhood. David didn't expect sympathy, but what followed surprised him. Strangers began sending letters. Veterans reached out, sharing similar stories of being misunderstood or mistreated after returning home. The support was overwhelming, but David stayed humble. He didn't want fame, only accountability. The police department released a statement saying they were reviewing procedures. But that wasn't enough. David knew that real change didn't come from words. It came from responsibility. He began to attend community meetings, speaking calmly and clearly about what had happened. He never raised his voice, never blamed anyone personally. Instead, he talked about fear, about misunderstanding, about the need for better training and empathy. People listened. His calmness made them pay attention. At one meeting, a young officer approached him afterward. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. What happened shouldn't have happened. David looked at him, his eyes tired but kind. You don't need to be sorry for what others did, he said. Just learn from it. That's how we make it matter. When he walked out that night, the air felt a little lighter. The pain was still there, but it had found a direction. Back at home, he sat on the porch again, looking up at the stars. The silence was still heavy, but this time it didn't feel empty. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that Rex's loyalty hadn't ended with that shot. It lived on, in the movement he had started, in the awareness he had awakened. He picked up Rex's collar one last time, holding it in his hands. You're still doing your duty, buddy, he whispered softly. Just in a different way now. He placed it on the table beside the folded flag. 2 symbols of service, one man's, one dog's, resting side by side. And for the first time since that day, David closed his eyes and allowed himself to rest. The next morning started quietly, but something in the air felt different. The world outside looked the same houses, the same street, the same breeze moving through the trees. But inside David's house there was a shift. He had changed even if no one else could see it yet. He woke up early, as he always did, but this time there was no sound of paws following him to the door. The silence that used to be peaceful now felt heavy. He walked to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window looking out at the empty yard. For a few minutes he didn't move. He just stood there, remembering all the mornings when Rex would sit by his leg, waiting for his signal to go outside. But the days of quiet walks were over now. The peace he had once protected so carefully had been broken. As the sunlight spread through the window, David turned away and sat down at the table. The article his friend had written lay there, printed out and folded neatly. The headline stared back at him. He had read it a dozen times already, but every time it brought the same mix of pain and pride. The story had spread further than he expected. People were sharing it, talking about it, demanding answers, but with the attention came something else, pressure. Some wanted him to speak publicly. Others wanted him to take legal action. Messages and letters started coming in from people he didn't know. Some shared stories of their own losses. Others offered legal help or donations. But David didn't want fame and he didn't want money. He wanted meaning. He wanted change. He looked down at the small photo of Rex on the table, taken back when they were both in service. The dog looked strong and alert, eyes full of life. David smiled faintly. You'd hate all this noise, he said quietly. You always liked calm. Still, he knew he couldn't just step back now. The story wasn't finished. That afternoon, he drove to the city to meet his friend again, the journalist who had helped share his story. She was sitting at a corner table in a small cafe, a notebook open beside her cup. When David walked in, she looked up and smiled faintly. You've become quite the name lately, she said. I didn't plan for that, he replied, sitting down. I know, she said softly. But people care about this story. It's not just about what happened to your dog. It's about trust, about how people are treated. You've touched something bigger. David nodded but stayed quiet. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He had lived a life in the shadows, where names and faces were often hidden for safety. Now suddenly everyone wanted to know his story. The journalist leaned forward. The police department released a new statement today, she said. They're still reviewing the incident, but they didn't apologize. Not directly. They're saying the officers acted under pressure. David's jaw tightened slightly. Pressure, he repeated. That's the word people use when they don't want to say fear. She watched him closely. Are you thinking about taking legal action? He shook his head. Maybe later. For now, I want the truth to be clear. Not just for me, for anyone this could happen to. They talked for a while longer, planning how to bring more attention to the inconsistencies in the case. The journalist wanted to publish a follow-up story, one that showed not only what happened but who David really was. A man who had given his best years to serve his country and asked for nothing in return. After leaving the cafe, David drove to the Veterans Center he used to volunteer at. It had been weeks since he'd gone there. The moment he stepped inside, a few familiar faces greeted him with quiet respect. One of the younger veterans came up and said, I saw the story. That was rough, sir. I'm sorry, David nodded. Thank you, he said simply. They talked for a while about training, about discipline, about how hard it was to adjust to life after service. Some of them shared how misunderstood they felt in public, how people looked at them differently when they mentioned they were veterans. David listened carefully, letting them speak. For years he had carried his pain alone, but now he saw how many others carried their own. That night, when he returned home, he sat at his desk and began to write. Not a report, not a complaint, just his thoughts. He wrote about Rex, about their missions together, about loyalty and trust. He wrote about how soldiers were trained to stay calm, to think before they act, and how that training was missing in the world outside. His words came slowly at first, but then they began to flow naturally. When he finished, he realized he had written several pages without stopping. He set the pen down and leaned back. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of release. The next day, he received a call from a local community leader who had read his story. They were organizing a forum on responsible policing and public trust, and they wanted him to speak. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker. He preferred silence to applause. But then he thought about Rex, about how the story wasn't just his, it was about everyone who had lost something because of fear and misunderstanding. "I'll come," he said finally. The forum was held in a small auditorium at a nearby college. When David arrived, the room was half full. People of all ages sat quietly waiting. Some were police officers in plain clothes. Others were citizens who had followed the story online. Cameras lined the back wall, recording everything. When it was his turn to speak, David walked to the front slowly. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. He looked out at the crowd and said, "I'm not here to make anyone angry. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I just want to talk about fear and how dangerous it can be when we let it control our actions." He spoke about his experience, about the day it happened, and about what it felt like to lose something so loyal and innocent in a moment of panic. But he also talked about forgiveness, about understanding, about how officers and citizens both needed better communication and training. The room was silent as he spoke. His words were calm but powerful. "When I was in service," he said, "we were taught that hesitation could cost lives, but we were also taught that discipline could save them. The difference between the two is judgment. You learn that judgment through patience, through listening, through empathy. That's what I want to see more of." When he finished, there was no loud applause at first, just quiet respect. Then slowly people began to clap, not because it was a performance, but because it was the truth. After the event, several people came up to thank him. One of the officers who had attended approached him privately. "Sir," the young man said quietly, "I'm sorry for what happened. Your words hit hard. We need to hear more voices like yours." David nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means something." As he walked to his truck afterward, he felt something shift inside him again. The pain was still there, but it had found direction. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was building something meaningful out of the loss. Days turned into weeks, and more people reached out. The story spread beyond his town. News outlets wanted interviews, veterans groups wanted him to speak, and animal rights organizations wanted to honor Rex's service. David agreed to some of them, but only the ones that felt genuine. He didn't want attention. He wanted awareness. The police department eventually released the body camera footage publicly. The video confirmed what witnesses had said, that Rex hadn't attacked or charged. The footage showed confusion, not danger. Public reaction grew stronger. Petitions began circulating online, demanding reforms in police training when dealing with animals. David stayed calm through it all. He didn't celebrate, didn't shout victory. He knew justice was a slow road. But for the first time, he felt like the truth was being seen. One afternoon, while sitting on his porch, he received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter from a police officer from another state. It read, "I watched your story. I used to be quick to draw conclusions, quick to act without understanding. But your calmness, your words, they changed how I see my job. I want to do better. Thank you for reminding me what courage really means." David folded the letter and set it beside Rex's collar. He smiled softly. That evening, he went to the backyard where he had planted a small tree in Rex's memory. It was still young, its branches thin but reaching upward. He stood there quietly, watching as the sunset painted the sky. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally, he spoke softly. "You're still protecting me, old friend. Still doing your duty? He walked back inside and looked around the small, quiet house. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful again in a new way. He had lost something irreplaceable, but he had found purpose through it. As he sat down and turned on the small lamp by his chair, the phone buzzed again. It was a message from the journalist. They're naming the new program for police canine training after Rex. You did that. David read the message and closed his eyes. For a moment he let the silence surround him, but this time it felt different, softer. Lighter, he whispered almost to himself. Good boy. Outside, the young tree swayed gently in the wind, and the world that once felt cruel began to look a little kinder. The man who once lived in silence had found his voice again, not through anger, but through strength, patience, and love. And though the world would remember the story for what was lost, David knew it was really about what was found: the power to heal, the courage to forgive, and the quiet strength to keep moving forward. The days after the incident moved slowly, like time itself had been wounded. Every morning the man woke up before sunrise, just like he had done for years, but this time there was no sound of paws against the floor. The house felt empty, and every quiet moment reminded him of what had been taken. He still made coffee at the same time, still stepped out to the porch to watch the first light. But now he stood alone, staring at the empty spot where Rex used to sit. He tried to live as if nothing had changed, but his mind kept replaying that single moment. The sound, the confusion, the disbelief. He had faced explosions, ambushes, and chaos overseas, but nothing compared to the quiet pain of losing Rex that way. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about loyalty, trust, and the feeling that justice had turned its back on him. He stayed quiet for weeks. The police department said it was an unfortunate mistake. They promised an internal review, but deep down he knew how these things worked. He had seen enough in life to understand when people were protecting themselves instead of the truth. Still, he didn't shout, he didn't argue. He knew emotion wouldn't fix anything. It never had. Instead, he decided to move with patience. He began to write down everything he remembered about that night. Every sound, every face, every word said. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but it helped him focus. He also started talking to people in the neighborhood. Some had seen what happened. Others had heard parts of it. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fall together. One evening, as he sat in his kitchen with his notebook open, he remembered a small camera mounted on the streetlight across from his house. It was part of the city's new security program. That memory sparked something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his time in the field. The next morning, he went to the city office and requested the footage. They told him it wasn't possible, that it was under review and not open for public release. But he didn't stop there. Years of training had taught him that persistence often mattered more than power. He began calling people, quietly, respectfully, but firmly. He contacted a retired officer he once helped during a rescue mission years ago. That man still owed him a favor. A week later, a small envelope arrived in his mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside was a USB drive. He didn't need to guess what it contained. He plugged it into his laptop, took a deep breath, and pressed play. The video started with normal street noise, cars passing, a few distant voices. Then came the arrival of the patrol car, the flashing lights reflecting off nearby houses. He watched himself step out of his house, calm as ever, speaking softly. He saw Rex standing beside him, not attacking, just alert. Then the command was shouted, and in less than 2 seconds, everything fell apart. He paused the video and leaned back in his chair. His eyes didn't show anger, just quiet disappointment. He had been trained to act fast, but also to think clearly. The footage showed the truth, that there was no threat, no reason for what happened. It wasn't rage that filled him. It was determination. That night he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this story fade away like so many others. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change. But to make that happen, he needed help. The right kind of help. He reached out to someone he trusted deeply, a journalist he had once saved overseas when an assignment went wrong. She was tough, honest, and known for uncovering stories people tried to hide. When he called her, she immediately recognized his voice. "It's been a long time," she said softly. "What's going on?" He told her everything, not just about Rex, but about how it happened, how the system reacted, and what he found on that footage. She didn't interrupt, didn't question. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Send me the video." Within days, she and her team started their investigation. They verified the footage, compared the body cam reports, and began to uncover inconsistencies. The officers' written statements didn't match what actually happened. The commands they claimed to have given weren't audible on the recordings. What they described as an aggressive dog attack looked on camera like a loyal animal standing protectively beside his owner. The journalist arranged to meet him in person for an interview, though he was hesitant. He didn't like attention. It made him uncomfortable. But she convinced him that speaking up wasn't just for himself. It was for others who had been silenced. They met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. She brought a small recorder, but mostly just listened. He spoke softly, without drama, describing everything from his military service to the moment he lost Rex. When she asked what he wanted out of all this, he simply said, "The truth." That's all. The truth and maybe a little respect. When the story was published, it spread faster than either of them expected. People were shocked to learn that the man at the center of the incident was not only innocent, but a decorated veteran, someone who had served his country with honor and bravery. The public couldn't understand how a man like that could be treated with such suspicion and carelessness. The story caught national attention. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded with discussions, and soon the police department was under pressure. They released a statement saying they were reviewing procedures, but the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted accountability. Amid all the attention, the man stayed quiet. He avoided interviews and cameras. He didn't want fame or sympathy. He just wanted people to see what really happened. He continued gathering evidence, speaking with lawyers, and helping the journalist connect with witnesses. Weeks turned into months. The department eventually announced an official investigation into the incident. It wasn't an easy process. There were attempts to downplay the story, to distract from the truth, but the evidence was too clear. The footage, the statements, and the eyewitness accounts all pointed to one fact. The situation could have been avoided if the officers had acted with calm and understanding. The man began receiving letters from people across the country, veterans, dog owners, and even police officers who felt ashamed of what had happened. Many wrote to thank him for handling it with dignity instead of anger. He read every letter, some with tears in his eyes. It reminded him that change, while slow, often began with quiet courage. One letter stood out. It came from a young officer in training. The letter read, "Sir, I watched your story and it made me realize how much responsibility comes with this badge. I promise to be the kind of officer who listens first and acts later." Those words touched him deeply. Maybe this was what justice looked like. Not revenge, but awareness. Meanwhile, the journalist continued her work. She found out that the department had received several complaints about one of the officers involved, none of which had been properly investigated. That revelation added more weight to the story. The community demanded reform, better training, more accountability, and respect for all citizens. The man attended one of the town meetings where the incident was being discussed. People stood up to share their opinions, some angry, some heartbroken. When it was his turn to speak, the room went silent. He stood tall but spoke softly. "I served this country because I believed in protecting people," he said. "I didn't expect special treatment. I only expected fairness. My dog wasn't a threat. He was family. What happened to him shouldn't happen to anyone, not to a person, not to an animal. I don't want anyone fired or hated. I just want this to never happen again." The crowd applauded, not because he said something dramatic, but because he spoke with truth and grace. It was a moment that reminded everyone that strength didn't always mean loudness. Sometimes it was found in quiet conviction. In the weeks that followed, the city announced new policies for handling calls involving animals. Officers would now receive specialized training on de-escalation and animal behavior. They also introduced a new partnership with local trainers to improve community police relationships. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress, and that mattered. The journalist published a follow-up story highlighting those changes, crediting him and Rex's story as the reason behind them. She titled it, "The Quiet Man Who Changed the Way We Listen." When he read that headline, he smiled faintly. Rex's photo sat on his table, a small framed picture of the dog sitting proudly beside him on a hiking trail. He touched the frame gently and whispered, "You did good, buddy." At night, he sometimes still heard the echo of that terrible moment, but now it was softer, replaced by the thought that maybe Rex's sacrifice had meant something, that his loss had led to awareness, compassion, and understanding. He started spending more time outside again, walking through the park, talking with neighbors. Some recognized him, thanked him, or simply nodded in respect. He never liked being called a hero, but in their eyes, he saw something that meant more: gratitude. The story wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt peace returning little by little. He knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but he had already faced worse and survived. This time, though, he wasn't fighting in silence. The truth was out there now, and it had power. After months of struggle, investigation, and quiet persistence, things began to shift. The man whose life had once been defined by silence and discipline now saw the beginnings of justice. The changes in the community, the new training programs for officers, and the conversations sparked by the story all reminded him that even small efforts could create impact. He walked through his neighborhood with a sense of calm that hadn't been there since the day he lost Rex. Though the grief was still present, it no longer weighed him down entirely. One afternoon, he stopped by the small tree he had planted in Rex's memory. Its branches were growing, stretching toward the sky, young leaves rustling in the breeze. He knelt and touched the trunk as if connecting with his loyal companion all over again. "You're still making a difference, buddy," he whispered softly. "Even without you here, people are learning." Over the weeks, letters and messages continued to arrive from people inspired by his story. Some were veterans, sharing their struggles with reintegration and public misunderstanding. Some were dog owners expressing heartbreak and gratitude. A few were officers admitting that they had been quick to act in fear and needed to learn empathy. He read every single one, never ignoring them, never rushing through. Each message reminded him that even in the smallest actions, life could still carry meaning and hope. The journalist who had helped him share his story reached out again. "They're finally moving on the training program," she said during a call. "They're naming it after Rex. Your dog's loyalty saved more than you know." He chuckled softly, a sound that felt strange after months of tension. "I think Rex would be proud," he said. He always liked when people did things the right way. When the news broke, the public response was overwhelming. Stories of Rex's bravery and loyalty filled newspapers and social media. People shared their own experiences, thanking the man for staying calm, for speaking the truth without anger, and for reminding everyone that courage could be quiet. For him, though, the attention was still secondary. What mattered was that the story had meaning. The mistake that had cost his beloved dog had become a lesson in accountability, training, and respect. It wasn't vengeance he wanted, it never had been. It was a quiet correction of wrongs, a reminder to the world that fear and misunderstanding could be dangerous, and that love and loyalty deserved recognition. One morning, he visited the Veterans Center again. It had been months since he had been there regularly. As he walked in, familiar faces greeted him with nods and smiles. Some had read the story. Others had seen the follow-up news about Rex's legacy. A young veteran approached him cautiously. "Sir, I just wanted to say, thank you," he said quietly. "Your story helped me talk about things I've kept inside for years. I feel like I can finally share my experience without feeling weak." David nodded, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. "You're not weak," he said softly. "You're human, and sharing is part of healing." The young man's eyes brightened, and he left with a sense of relief. David watched him go, realizing that Rex's impact went far beyond their own bond. The loyalty of one dog had inspired courage and empathy in countless people. Days later, he received an invitation from the city council. They were holding a public ceremony to officially launch the new police canine training program, named after Rex. Initially, he hesitated. Public events made him uncomfortable, but he knew this wasn't about him. It was about awareness and lasting change. He accepted. The ceremony was small but meaningful. Officers, trainers, community members, and local journalists attended. A plaque was unveiled, honoring Rex's memory and symbolizing the importance of understanding and compassion in handling animals and public safety. The man stood quietly in the crowd, hands folded in front of him, watching as others acknowledged the bond between humans and dogs, and the lessons it could teach about patience and trust. One officer, standing beside the plaque, shook his head in disbelief and said quietly, "I never realized what training really meant until now." The man smiled faintly. "It's never too late to learn," he replied. After the ceremony, he returned home and walked to the backyard. The tree he had planted had grown taller, leaves fluttering softly in the afternoon wind. He stood there for a long time, letting the quiet of the yard fill him. Memories of Rex, playful, brave, and endlessly loyal, and came and went, mingling with the knowledge that the dog's legacy would live on in more than just a tree or a plaque. He thought about the past months, the grief, the investigation, the public attention, and realized how much he had changed. He had moved from silent mourning to careful action, from quiet anger to disciplined purpose. Rex had taught him once again, even in death, that loyalty and courage could inspire change far beyond what one person could imagine. A few weeks later, he was invited to speak at a national conference on public safety and animal handling. He accepted, not for recognition, but to share lessons learned. Standing in front of hundreds of people, he spoke calmly, describing the incident, the importance of understanding animal behavior, and the necessity of patience and discipline in stressful situations. He emphasized that courage wasn't always loud or violent. It could be quiet, controlled, and full of integrity. Audience members listened intently, many taking notes, others nodding in agreement. When he finished, the applause wasn't for a dramatic speech, but for honesty and clarity. People left the room talking about responsibility, training, and respect. And though he never sought applause, he felt a quiet pride, the kind that comes from knowing that one small action can ripple outward, changing lives. At home that evening, he sat by the table, looking at Rex's framed photo and the small collection of medals and keepsakes from his military service. He traced the outline of the dog's face with his finger, smiling softly. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. "We made it matter. Your life mattered. Time moved on as it always does." The man continued his quiet life, working on small projects, visiting the Veterans Center, walking through the neighborhood, and mentoring younger veterans. He spoke when it mattered, acted when it mattered, but he never sought the spotlight. He had learned that the true impact of courage, loyalty, and integrity often went unseen, but it was no less powerful. One day, while walking through the park, he saw a young dog playing with its owner. The dog reminded him of Rex, alert, strong, and full of life. He stopped and watched quietly. The owner waved and he nodded politely, feeling a pang of both sadness and joy. Life continued, and so did the lessons Rex had taught him. At night, he sometimes sat on the porch, looking up at the stars, reflecting on the journey. He thought about the pain, the public attention, the investigation, and the changes that had come as a result. Though Rex was gone, his spirit lingered, not only in memories but in the awareness he had sparked, the people he had inspired, and the community he had helped guide toward understanding. He knew that grief would never fully leave, but he also knew that it didn't have to consume him. Through patience, purpose, and quiet determination, he had transformed loss into something meaningful. He had taken tragedy and shaped it into action, showing that even in the face of loss, one could make a difference. Years later, visitors to the city's training center would ask about the story behind the program. Trainers would tell them about Rex, the loyal dog who had stood beside a man who had given everything to serve his country. They would talk about courage, patience, and the quiet strength it takes to do what is right. And though the man himself rarely attended these retellings, he knew deep inside that Rex's legacy lived on, in hearts, in minds, and in the changes that had been set in motion. The man continued to walk his quiet streets, to help veterans, to mentor, and to live with the memory of his loyal companion. He had faced loss, injustice, and misunderstanding, but he had met each challenge with discipline, patience, and heart. The lessons he carried were not just for himself. They were for anyone willing to listen, willing to act, and willing to learn. And sometimes when the wind rustled through the leaves of the small tree he had planted for Rex, he could almost hear a soft bark, a gentle nudge, or a quiet presence beside him. It was a reminder that loyalty does not die with loss, that courage does not fade with tragedy, and that even the smallest life can leave a mark on the world. He smiled softly, letting the quiet fill him. "We did good, buddy," he whispered once more. We really did. And with that, he turned back to his house, ready to continue living, teaching, and honoring the life that had given him so much strength. The story of loss had become a story of change, and though the road ahead was long, he knew he would walk it with the same calm determination that had carried him through every mission, every challenge, and every moment of life. The man, the veteran, and the quiet hero who had once walked unnoticed through the streets, now knew that true courage could be measured not by battle, but by patience, persistence, and the strength to turn loss into purpose. And Rex, forever loyal, had guided him there, silently, faithfully, and eternally.